This conference will now be recorded.
So last week we were reading chapter 2 and the notes were up on the website. And that chapter mostly focused on why we look at narratives, why we use memoirs, why we use lived experiences as part of our teaching or pedagogy, especially in relation to social justice. I don't know if you have any questions coming from the notes that I put up. Um, and like the previous week, what I'm trying to do is just kind of summarize the key points or highlight certain points that will help us as we go further. So this week we're doing chapter 3, 4, and 5, which are the chapters on the memoirs. And the first is by Bev Sellers, and it's called They Called Me Number One. She, I think at the time her book was released, was an Indian or native chief in Canada. I know that she's a lawyer, and so she wrote this memoir about her years in residential schooling in Canada. The second memoir is by Glenn Retief, who was South African or is South African. And I know that he I think he's been in academia somewhere in the US for a while. And he wrote that memoir about his days in boarding school in South Africa during the apartheid era of South Africa. So that's before 1995. And then the last one is called Kaffir Boy by Mark Matavani. And he, South African, also ended up in academia somewhere in the US. And unlike Glenn and Bev, Mark did not go, like, his memoir is not focused in any kind of residential or boarding school, but it focuses on his entire experience of apartheid from the time he was very, very small, even before he started going to school. And it also highlights his family and particularly his parents' experience of racism and discrimination and apartheid. So, what we're doing today is, like the previous 2 weeks, I'm just highlighting certain things that will help us kind of move forward in reading this text. Okay, so to start off with, one of the key things, if not the main message in my book, is subjectivity, how we look at it, how we formulate it, how we understand it. Who is the subject of education? And we talked a little bit about this in the first session. Who is the subject of the services that you provide, whether you're in a school, in some kind of social or community services? There's a subject that you need to know, need to understand, and need to work with. And sometimes because we set up shop and then people come, we don't often think in terms of this service was built because of this particular person. We have generalized ideas of the goals or objectives that we're trying to fulfill by providing a service. So my book encourages us to look at each individual's subjectivity and ask how the services or the classroom serves that particular person, which might seem like a lot of work and kind of getting into the personal, especially in terms of a classroom. If you have 30 or whatever students and you're thinking like, geez, how am I going to know every student's personal story and everything that they will need to get out of this, what triggers them, what will build their self-esteem and all of that. So it's a big question to ask yourself, what do you know about their experience within your space, and what have you learned about their experience in your space? So when they come in, there's a level of understanding that we assume we have. Especially, I've seen this especially in people that have been in their field for a significant amount of time, whether it's teachers or social workers, um, who will often say, "Oh, I've worked with so many people like him or like her. I've seen this before." And so there's an assumption that we know who the subject is. And so if we go back to our first session, this is the transference that we talked about. And we often, as service providers or educators and teachers, react to our students and service users in that transference based on experiences and repetitions. We talked before about repetitions that we've had with other students. And so when that new learner comes into class, something about her or him reminds us of that student you had 3 years ago or 13 years ago or whatever the case might be. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, because if you can recognize your transference and counter transference, if you can see that this is what's going on, then you have a better chance of, first of all, addressing whatever that repetition is. But if there are certain things that you feel you might have done better or you did wrong with that person 13 years ago, this might be an opportunity for you to learn. We talked about learning in the first session. So this book really focuses on the subjectivity of individuals. And it's not subjectivity like we use it in everyday language. Like we talked about the first week and a little bit last week, it's subjectivity in terms of the psyche, like the psychoanalytic meaning or understanding of subjectivity, which is basically that there's a big other, the big O, that has written the discourse of this person within this space. And so when they come in, particularly for students of color, racialized students, students of uh, a different sexuality or whatever might set them apart, when they come into this space, they come in and take on this discourse that was written by the other, and thus become the subject of a discourse that existed before they came into the space and will likely exist even after they leave. And what you don't want is for that discourse to have a negative impact on the subject, because to start off with, you don't want them to feel like they have no agency or power. So this is why I used memoirs in a time in our human history where we would say things were really bad. Apartheid was set on the premise that Black people were inferior, Black people needed to be controlled, and Black people should not have the same rights and so forth. And in Canada, these were the same beliefs and values that were pushing the Indian Education Act. And so we might say, well, it's 2020, that was in the 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever the case might be. Things have changed a lot in that time. Things have changed. But what you often find, which is why we talk about systemic racism, is systems change at a glacial pace. And so now what we have are educators whose ideals and values might not match those ideals and values that were in operation 30 or 40 years ago. But still, the fundamentals, the foundation of that system has not changed as much. And so we talked before about the teacher standing in front of the classroom and feeling that the authority they represent is not necessarily what they want to represent, and that is part of the problem. So both the teacher and the learner are in this discourse that has been going on for a while and might not see how they can extricate themselves or separate themselves from this discourse. So on page 74 in the text, I say to be able to tell one's narrative is to act on the insistence of one's agency. So Salas, through her memoir, tackles much of what you could only experience as absurd in childhood. The contradictions and paradoxes we witness in her narrative allow us to interpret the cry of distress of Indian children in residential schools at the time, going through horrific rituals, their agency negated and beaten out of them. In adulthood, Sellers is able to give us an account through her own working through. We witness in her memoir the difference between knowledge as power and knowledge as a threat. We learn how children can disintegrate when adults cause meaning and meaning making to collapse through rituals in education. Deep things that affect must be narrated. If they cannot be narrated, if meaning cannot be reinterpreted, revisited, resituated, and reorganized, we witness the psychic disintegration. And this quote is significant in Christina brought up agency in the first session. And we talked about the contradictions and paradoxes of our own position as educators or service providers. But the other part of it is when you take away agency, you take away meaning making for the subject. And so the classroom or the space that you've provided becomes something that they cannot understand or cope in. And so sometimes what they do, like in Sellers' memoir, you find that the children in this residential school did not understand why they were treated that way, why corporal punishment was the order of the day, why they were often denigrated and insulted. They had their names taken away from them. Like the name of her memoir is They Called Me Number One, because the entire time she was in that residential school, that was her name, number one. So they took away something that's very, very significant, her name. Then they took away her culture, they took away her language. And so she was in this space that had no meaning to her. And yet she was supposed to value it and know what to do when, know how to fulfill the expectations of her oppressors. And we find that this is still very common today. When we see students are put in a space where the things that they learned at home, the things that they valued through family are taken away or labeled in a way that makes those things appear negative, right? And so when this happens, we've taken away agency, we've taken away the ability to make meaning of things for that child because there's no point of reference for them. This is all adults and teachers and educators and school boards and directors and policies and everything that's writing this discourse where this person is supposed to function and fulfill those expectations, right, of the educators. So another important thing is when we talk about culture. So I mentioned one of the things that you would identify in They Called Me Number One is how much of the culture of the natives was eradicated through oppression, through racism, but most especially through education. So the children were taken away from their families when they were very, very small, and some of them never returned home. And the spaces in which they were put, there was no one that honored, respected, or even knew or understood their culture. And so when we start to talk in terms of privilege and why we talk a lot about white privilege is because in a lot of these spaces, especially in our education systems, the culture that is there belongs to one group of people. Culture privileges its people. So if a school is built on native culture, it privileges native children. If a school is built on African or Afrocentric culture, it privileges those children. And why are diverse or racialized children not privileged in classrooms or in education? It's because the culture that underlies the whole system is not theirs. So there's a culture of speaking humanism. This is a quote that I'm getting into on page 23, but not practicing it within education. And within this culture, Mishra Tak posits that those who uphold Western education, often characterized as a humanistic endeavor, maintain a non questioning stance towards classical notions of subjectivity. This stance misleadingly renders the foundations of human subjectivity transparent, stable, and untraceable. It is upon this presumed stability of the subject that many educational practices, cognitive and social theories, curricula, and pedagogies depend. So we had a school that was built 50 years ago on a certain culture to privilege a certain people. And then 50 years later, not much has changed in that culture. So students that come in who do not naturally fall into that culture find it to be difficult to function, difficult to understand, difficult to succeed. We know about the IQ testing in the past, and later research showed that the mechanisms for the testing privileged white people of a certain class and of a certain education or understanding or culture over certain people. And so they would naturally score higher because it's of their culture. And this hasn't changed much in education. I'll give an example, and I don't know if I've given it before, about my nephew who was at school here in Ireland. And so one time I was speaking to him and he asked me what I do. And I told him I'm a teacher. He's like, no, you're not. I said, yeah, I'm an educator. I teach at a university. And he said, no, you're black, you're African. And I said to him, what does that mean? And he said, black or African people don't teach. So I asked him, what do you mean we don't teach? He's like, you don't do jobs like that. First of all, because in his school, there were no people of color. And second, what he had learned about his school was about the San and the Khoi, the hunters and gatherers. And so in his mind, black people or African people are only good as hunters and gatherers, because in his entire schooling, and at the time he was probably 9 or 10 years old, that's all he had learned about Africa or black people. And so that became his understanding that even as teachers, we do not fit into the education system. Because why is it that in his 5 or whatever years of schooling, all he had ever heard about black people was they hunted and gathered and wore grass or animal skins? And not to mention, his entire family are people who do jobs that he just could not make meaning of. And so for me to say, well, actually, and then he was like, one of my brothers is a surgeon and all of that. So I asked him about all these things and I could see the confusion in his face. Because how did all of you people do all these things? How are you in these occupations, engineers and all of that, but you're hunters and gatherers? And because he's on this side of the world, our history and our stories as Africans and as Black people are not included in the classroom, except as hunters and gatherers, which was hundreds of years ago, right? So that became his understanding of who we are as a people. So how can I be a teacher? And I think part of that, now he's in secondary school, he's in high school, and he's had a lot of tensions at his school because now he's in a space where there are more Black students, so there's more of them, but there's still no teachers of color. And by teachers of color, I'm not talking just Black teachers, I'm talking any other color but white. And so there's this constant tension in him, in students, when they see that the authority is embodied in a certain type of people. And these certain types of people often have a discourse or an opinion of us that is not positive, and we're in a space that was not created for us. So in Toronto, there's an Afrocentric school, and I remember when they first started running the school, it was often in the news because it was just this thing like, why are these Black people separating themselves? They're teaching their own history, they're teaching their own cultures, and all of that. And the reason why is because a lot of parents saw that I cannot teach my child everything that they need to know. Parents work, parents have other responsibilities and all of that. But I want my children to understand who they are and how they fit in into this world. And so this school is constantly in the news, and anytime something comes up, they always have an opinion from either the directors of the school or the principal of the school, because it's another voice that has too long been silenced that needs to be included in the conversation. So, as a colonial measure, Indigenous children were systematically alienated from their language, culture, and families through brute force and constant abuse. Consequently, with education came a rejection of Indian values as pagan in favor of what seemed safer and acceptable to their oppressors. And so you ended up seeing Indigenous people who did not speak their languages, who had names that were not of their languages, who converted to Catholicism or Christianity because it was safer physically to do that. And so another thing that I pick up in the book is this idea of absurdity. So the educator or teacher of the past was idealized as white. That was the ideal teacher like 50, 60, whatever years ago. That's all you needed to be white, because it was assumed if you're white, you carry within you the necessary tools, resources, ability to teach. Why? Because you were part of the culture, right? And then today's teacher must be a social activist, unbiased, anti oppressive, and a hero. And how can any teacher be all of these things and still teach within a system that is fundamentally oppressive? And I've had teachers, I remember at one conference where I was doing a similar presentation, and she was actually a professor, not like primary or secondary school teacher. And she started to cry. And she said, you know what? I feel like there's all these things that I need to do, that I need to be the good teacher. I need to be anti-oppressive. I need to know how to work with people from diverse backgrounds and diverse cultures and all of that. But the truth is, I'm just a white woman. And that was her thing. And as a white woman, I don't know how to do these things, but I feel that responsibility on me. And what she's basically saying is the system allows me this position, gives me this space and this authority, and then tells me, like, you know what, it's 2020, we have equity, diversity, and inclusion now, go do your job. And a lot of people don't know how to do that. They don't know how to do that because often what we know is based on our own lived experiences, which is why narratives are important. But also, if the system in which we did our own education was not diverse, was not inclusive, did not care about equity, where would we learn to do that? Because it doesn't come through good intentions. We need the right resources, we need the right tools, we need the right understanding. And a good place to start is by understanding who is the subject of education. So basically, ideals change while the fundamental and cultural values of systems remain stagnant. I remember when I was doing my postgrad, I was teaching an undergraduate class, first year undergrads in Toronto. And one of the things I had to teach was about cultural capital. And the basic lesson was, if we want more students from diverse backgrounds to succeed, we need to teach them the right cultural capital. And I remember thinking, but that's not changing the system. What that is alienating them from the cultural capital they already have, telling them that what you know from your home as a Black person, as Asian, or whatever it is useless and won't get you far. What you need to know is what white people know. What you need to live and understand and value is what white people understand, know, and value. And then when you know this, you are likely to succeed. You're likely to go further. So that in itself is stagnant, right? It hasn't changed. If we're still talking about cultural capital as the way for people to succeed within a certain system, and that system is fundamentally based on white supremacy, we have not moved forward. And the problem with this is, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes, is that whiteness itself, the ideals of it, are impossible even for a lot of white people. And so you have a lot of anxious white people, a lot of alienated people of color, alienated people of different sexualities, all in this system that tells them, if you want to succeed, be as white as possible, right? So it uh, it is extraordinary how all ritual, even that most personal so-called habit, grows from and memorializes the encounter with the other. The other demanded a performance of rituals and tasks beyond the comprehension of Beverly or Bev and her peers, but the children recognized the relevance these rituals held in meaning making and socialization. So the children recognized their roles in the meaningless ritual were the key to any semblance of community and played along. In so doing, children gave meaning to their oppressors' actions, notably satisfying the desire of their other. So, as educators, as service providers, we need to be aware and mindful of the rituals we introduce into the classroom. What are they serving? What do they mean to the child? Because what ends up happening, and I think in the book I gave an example of this practice that was common in a lot of African school and obviously inherited through the colonial system, that when the teacher walks into the classroom, you stand up and you all say hello in unison. You wait for a response and then you respond and then wait to be told to sit down. And I remember thinking at some point, like, this is crazy. This makes no sense. And especially when you expect little 4-year-olds to do this. And the kid that doesn't stand up or trails behind or whatever, that kid is labeled as doing something wrong. So, right from the start of the day, there are little rituals here and that we don't quite understand. And I've seen these popular videos that have come up of teachers that stand outside the door and hug or high five and do all these supposed to be um, welcoming and funny and sweet and connecting things with each student. And it's all great and fun and all of that, but whose desire does that fulfill? Because I think of myself when I was a student, I would not have enjoyed that. I would have felt that I'm performing for my teacher and the rest of the class. So if I don't do this, I'm being a stick in the mud. And so likely I would have done it, but I would not have enjoyed it because that is not who I am. That's not my personality. Some kids would enjoy it, and that would be who they are and their personality. And so, again, we come to that paradox for the teacher. Do they serve one student or serve many? If 10 out of 15 like it, the other 5 can just deal, right? And so for teachers, it's quite a difficult thing when you think about who is the subject and what are these rituals and meanings, who's meaning making, what kind of socialization is this, and who benefits from it? Okay. So ultimately, we need to ask what and whose values are fundamental to the culture in our systems and services. And on the other side of that is who is the subject. And when you consistently have a subject who seems to be butting heads with those values and fundamentals of the culture, there's an issue there. Just was it last month or early this month? One of the school boards in Toronto, the Peel District School Board, which has had many years of a lot of conflict, they were often in the papers from the board of the school and parents complaining, and it was usually Black parents and parents of Muslim children, their children being unfairly suspended, expelled, a lot of punitive actions from educators and teachers. Like in a couple of cases, I remember one case I read about a 5-year-old girl was handcuffed by the police, whose reasoning was we she lost control of herself and we needed to control her. So two big policemen put this little girl in handcuffs. And so in this school board, what ended up happening was the Minister of Education, after years of these type of things happening, was like, right, I am going to put an independent group of people who will evaluate and listen to these stories and come up with a report so we know what to do. And what the independent people uncovered was even worse than what we'd been reading in the papers. It was consistent across the board that Black students, Muslim students were constantly being expelled, being suspended, being called into the principal's office, the police being called on them, especially if they're in secondary school. Teachers saying remarks about, like, one student was told, if you don't like it or something like that, go and be a drug dealer at a street corner like your father. This is in a class full of their peers. And so it's like a lot of horrible things. And anytime parents brought it to the board, they were shut down, they were ignored, they were not listened to, or they were made to be the, I suppose, guilty party in all of this. And so this school board has a culture that puts students of color, particularly Black and Muslim students, in a certain space, in a certain place, in a certain discourse. So, like in Bev's situation, the native children were basically the devils, while the church and the white people were the good people. And these children had to strive to become as close to white as possible as some kind of redemption. And that's the discourse they were brought into. But in 2020, we're still seeing this for certain students in the system. Certain students come in almost as if they're faceless and nameless to serve a particular role within the school. They are the bad kids. They are the difficult to manage kids. They are the kids that show everything you shouldn't be. They're the kids that justify certain policies, certain actions for the school board, for the principals, for the entire system. And so these kids just become a commodity. And so what this report has exposed is that, you know what, things actually haven't changed. We still have certain students cast into certain roles to fulfill the desire of the other, right? So next we talk about whiteness, which in the book I use Glenn Retief's the Jack Bank. That's the name of his book, the Jack Bank, to talk about whiteness. So on page 93, white people are trained to be white by institutions, explains Suchet. who believes that these institutions shelter white people, and as such, whiteness cannot be separated from institutional and social power, whether experientially or ideologically. That means when these institutions are challenged by demands for social justice, white people are left without shelter and afraid. Within the institution of education, Glenn and his peers were taught to be white. However, their sheltering by these institutions was different to what we might witness in prevailing cases of white privilege. Demonstrably, the perversion of racism was through acts of physical and sexual violence. Whiteness was taking the position of abuser of Black people. Supremacy was to believe in the fundamental fantasy of whiteness being perfect, and pedagogy was abuse and denigration. Because it was the culture in South Africa at the time to abuse, to beat, to kill, do whatever to Black people, these kids went to school and learned how to do that. And he talks about a particular teacher who would say, who would push them to imagine each other in positions of Blackness and therefore punish each other for taking these positions. So there was a lot of violence. And this boy went to the school at the age of 12. And as is normal in a lot of schools, and or was normal, the juniors, the ones coming in, are often the more submissive to the seniors and so forth. So from the age of 12, he's beaten quite a lot. But on top of that, he was gay, which was seen as another, what's the word? Uh, Transgression. Yes, that's the word. Another transgression against whiteness. Because white is masculine, white is strong, white is power, white is authority, white is violence. And then there you have this 12-year-old boy who's gay, and I guess his peers could tell that he was gay or knew that he was gay, and so punished him for that because that transgressed the ideal of whiteness. And imagine this from the age of 12 until 18. That becomes the culture just of violence, of anything that, if I think he uses some examples of how they would insult each other, like you're a Black woman or you're this and that, right? So again, these kids have come into a system with a certain culture and certain fantasy and ideal, and as a form of perversion, they become the instruments, the commodities, the objects that fulfill this idea, this fantasy of the perfection of whiteness. And they were white. So racism and discrimination against learners of color ultimately harms all learners as it maintains a divide between what is ideal and what is not. Privileging one group over another breeds other forms of oppression. So in Glenn's case, it was homophobia. And what I'm saying here is when you have a student who is not racialized but has certain behaviors, you will often hear he's acting Black, right? Or he's acting Muslim, or he's acting whatever it is. The other thing was gender. They would often insult each other as acting female, as being girls, as being sissies, and anything that is feminine is to be inferior. And so when you start to discriminate against people for a certain cultural or physical characteristic and associate those stereotypes, because that's the other thing I talk about in the book. I go into how stereotypes work and how they are used to support discrimination and racism, and to carry on using difference as a way to privilege certain students and not others. And so once you have this system in place, that means students that are white have to be perfect. They have to fulfill that ideal. And if they're failing to do that, then they're failing to uphold the culture of the school, the fantasy. And what happens there is they become, what's the word? They're seen as inferior, they're seen as transgressing. And for a lot of students, it's too much pressure and too much responsibility to justify racism and discrimination. But it's not uncommon to use our learners and our students to justify those systems, right? So the use of learners or children to satisfy ideals and justify racism and discrimination is fundamental and has always been fundamental to education systems. So even before we talk about it in terms of race and simply talk about it in terms of class, they had to satisfy something. Because if they don't satisfy this, then we as the adults, as the educators, the policymakers, and all of that can't justify why we have certain policies and practices in place. So it becomes that our students and our learners are there to make us feel good about the work that we're doing, to justify our policies, our spending, whatever it is that we decide to do. They need to do it for us. And so, like I said previously, in Bev's case, the kids understood this, that if we are not bad, then they have no reason to hit us, which makes them bad people, and they can't stand that. And so they would start lying and making up stories to earn themselves that corporal punishment to keep the system going. Because the adults, the nuns and the priests and stuff, had no justification if what they had said these kids are was not true. And so the kids would do it. I lied, I stole, I did this, even though they did not do any of those things. But they were used and trained to keep the system going. So education became an act of perversion when it became a mechanism for maintaining this fantasy of whiteness. Okay. Young Bruhl describes childism. This is a little small, I'm not sure if you can see it, as a prejudice that rationalizes or justifies acts that harm children or fail to meet their basic needs. But at the more fundamental motivational or fantasy level, childism can be defined as a belief system that constructs its target group, the child, as, as an immature being produced and owned by adults who use it to serve their own needs and fantasies. So in Ray Tiff's book, In the Jack Bank, the perverse ideology of white supremacy required children to be subordinate to the extent of performing perverse acts against each other. Like he talks about one incident where they were sexually assaulting each other in the bathroom because it was expected of them. And I also refer to some literature on the rape culture in apartheid South Africa, where white men would often rape white women with impunity because they felt it was expected of them. This is how we control them. This is how we show our dominance, our superiority, right? So their participation in the cycle of oppression enforced through violence and abuse was a measure expected of children in order to maintain their government's perverse belief in white supremacy. A refusal to participate by either hurting or being hurt met with corporal punishment. So we might look at it as race-based in Bev's situation, but in Glenn's situation, these are white kids in a white supremacist country that are being forced to act in these ways as a way to justify white supremacy. So from the time they're small, the government is using them to justify its apartheid system. So now we ask, what is the value of education? So in the previous chapter, in last week's notes, we talked a little bit about why it's important to interrogate the history of education. And one of the reasons being it gives us a starting point. So if this is what we used to be or where we used to be, where are we now and where are we heading? And so stories like these, narratives like these, give us an indication of where we used to be. But they also highlight for us, because we can still draw similar comparisons, unfortunately, between what was happening then and what is happening now. So, to the subject, education is a space one can begin to explore the wider world and find their place in it. For the other, it is a mechanism of law. But there's another party that doesn't often figure into the classroom dynamic, which is the parent. And for the parent, education is a promise made to the learner or the child. I've had a lot of friends who have a child go on mat leave, and then it's time to go back to work, which means it's time to send the child to daycare. And the trauma for this parent to release that care into somebody else's hand. Or I remember when I worked before with primary schools, when kids first come into kindergarten and their parents are dropping them off that first day, that first week, and the trauma of it, not just for the child, but for the parent. Because what the parent is basically saying to the child, I'm leaving you here because it's a safe space. They're promising their child, just by enrolling them and dropping them off to school, they're making a promise that it's a safe place. As your parent, as your caregiver, I would not put you in an environment that is harmful and traumatic. And yet it is. And it's something that a lot of parents, especially parents like immigrants and people of color, like when you look at the history of this Peel District School Board that I was talking about, parents got to the point of feeling absolutely helpless because their children were being harmed. They followed the policies, the procedures, and nothing was done. And so they ended up writing a petition to the Minister of Education. We need somebody to save our children, right? So Matabane in Careful Boy shares what his mom said to him, and this is before he went to school. And just a little bit of background. So people of color, or the Bantu people, were expected to have papers. Now, these papers were, I guess, similar to a license. So anytime the police stop you, you produce your papers. And those papers would have to show that you have a right to be there, that you're not transgressing, that the government has allowed you to be in that space. So for him to go to school, he needed a birth certificate. And it took his mom a long time, I think something like 2 years or so, to finally get the right papers for him to go to school. And she would take him to the registration office and here and there and everywhere as she was trying to get these papers for him. And on the other side was his dad, who had for years had no papers, and so did under the table type of work, was often thrown into jail, in and out, and sometimes the family would go for months without seeing him because he was stopped by police and he didn't have papers. So in Matabane's story, papers are a very, very important thing. The same way that education is important to a lot of parents, and they will drag their kids to school. They will do this, they will do that because they want their kid to have that diploma. And with that diploma, they're saying life will be different. You will be happier, you will be successful, you will be all these great things. So his mother says to him, I want things to be different for you, child. For you and your brother and sisters, I want you to go to school because I believe that an education is the key you need to open up a new world and a new life for yourself. A world and a life different from that of either your father's or mine. It is the only key that can do that, and only those who seek it earnestly and perseveringly will get anywhere in the white man's world. Education will open doors where none seem to exist. It'll make people talk to you, listen to you, and help you, people who otherwise wouldn't bother. It will make you soar like a bird lifting up into the endless blue sky. and leave poverty, hunger, and suffering behind. It'll teach you to learn to embrace what's good and shun what's bad and evil. Above all, it'll make you a somebody in this world. It'll make you grow up to be a good and proud person. And that's why I want you to go to school, child, so that education can do all of that and more for you. So this is a mother promising her son that if you get educated, this is what you have to look forward to. And he finally gets to school and he works hard, and his mom's promise, and even when he gets beaten, even when he doesn't have enough, no matter what he's facing, he keeps thinking, my mom told me education is the key. And then at some point, the government of South Africa introduced the Bantu Education Act, which basically said all education would be in Afrikaans. They would no longer be teaching anything in a different language, whether it's English or any of the Bantu languages. So everybody has to learn the Afrikaans and do the African um, curricula and all of that. And if you're aware of South African history, it's at this time that these learners, these children, protest. They lost it, and they burned down buildings and schools, and they fought for their education. And the reason why is because their parents, who were often humiliated and castrated in really awful ways, kept telling them education is it. And it's very similar for a lot of students today. Immigrants will tell their kids, we're moving to Canada or Ireland or the US or whatever it is, because life will be better for you there, and you'll go to school and you can be anything you want. So this kid buys into that promise, goes to school, and the teacher tells them, as a Black student, you should probably just focus on sports, or this is too complicated and too difficult for you. It's not really for your type of people. And I'm saying this because that was another thing they highlighted in the Peel District School Board, that they were pushing Muslim and Black students into non-academic classes, regardless of their ability or capability or capacity to do academic work. They were being pushed into these. And so what you have is a school that is directly contradicting the promise that these parents have made. You have a school that is telling the kid, like, yeah, your parents sent you here and basically lied to you. And so for this Matabani guy, in his story, you see that tension of home and school. His father, who has constantly been castrated and abused and oppressed, starts to fear, if his son goes to school, what will become of him. And part of this fear is feeling that he will lose his son to a system that does not privilege Black people. And a lot of Black parents or a lot of Muslim parents feel that when you send them into a space or a classroom that has a culture that is based on the fundamental fantasy or belief of white supremacy. So that's a summary of the 3 chapters. So educational systems need to pay attention to the subjectivities created through policies, programs, and practices, curriculum, teacher-student interactions, even seemingly adjunct factors like school fundraisers, sports, and extracurricular activities. The history of education must be a warning, not a standard for our current systems. Future directions must focus more on mitigating harmful cultures rather than traditionalizing them. And the role of the learner must change from that of commodity to one of agent. Okay, so our hour is up, but if you have time, we'll do some questions or discussion if there's anything you want to touch on. Please go ahead.
I had something that I wanted to add that related to an earlier point you made about the dilemma being that now the teacher needs to be kind of the social justice warrior, activist, and mitigate the harm that's done systematically. And it relates to coronavirus times. There's a big push in the California community college system right now to focus on equity and diversity. And a lot of that happened prior to coronavirus. And there's different sorts of funding for that activity. And a lot of it is focused on relationship building between teacher and student, student and student, and student and counselors and cohorts, so that there's school becomes kind of sticky through relationship building that is attentive to racial equity and justice issues. And then comes coronavirus. And so it happened so suddenly. There was such a shift to online education, and many of the students that I work with don't have access to computers or stable internet connections and so on and so forth. And so now some of that, they're now trying to bring some of that equity and justice lens into the online teaching. And from a teacher's perspective, it's very overwhelming because I am meant to put all my lessons online, you know, with a shift of about 3 days to meet the needs of my students who have varying degrees of access to technology. So something even like grading a paper, if my students are trying to access my comments on a paper using a computer laptop, they're going to have better luck. If their internet connection is stable, they can read, we can have a conversation. But if they're trying to access it on their cell phone, or they're trying to access a video conference call on their cell phone, they can't show their faces, the sound quality is not as good. Like, there's all these barriers, and we just got invited to do these webinars that are supposed to be addressing equity issue. And I remember opening it up, and I signed up for them, but it is so overwhelming because not only am I trying to take the content of my class and put it online, now I have to figure out the varying degrees of access to the technology that students have, and the teacher is meant to resolve that for the student. And that is overwhelming, you know? So anyway, I just thought I would share that, because that's certainly a systematic failure that is even bigger than the educational system. So, but the bodies, yeah, anyway, that I thought that was a very interesting point that you had made, Tapo. And I don't think these things are going to resolve between the good intentions of the teachers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Tapo. It's very good to, I really appreciated you walking us through your like revised notes and hearing some of your comments, like from how you're, you know, how you see like the big takeaways from your book. I think that what I've been thinking a lot about is memoir, because I think there's something about the way you write about it and reading these stories that makes me think about my own work a little bit deeper, especially since I'm going to start in the middle of June with a master's level course of with a new cohort of students who are in a master's level of teacher education program in science, and we're going to do it all online like everybody else. So we were speaking this morning, and I about how we build community, how we're going to get to know these people, and I can't help to think about how to integrate some of this work about memoir, about thinking about our own injustices and our own, you know, personalized experiences in education, and bring that to the surface. You know, have bring that out very quickly with having people write and to talk a little bit in that work with this new group. And also, I work with teachers And then I work with teachers who are already teaching and having some of the same challenges that you mentioned, Kimberly, about access to the technology and how demoralizing it has been for the teachers because they only have 20% of their students participating, and how they feel so inferior and just so bad about themselves. They're not feeling good about the remote teaching they're doing at all. And now they even have principals, I just couldn't believe. I believe her because I know the teacher, but who say you can't even talk about coronavirus with your students. It's too emotional for the kids, even though many of our students, the teachers are teaching, are really living the day-to-day reality with coronavirus and personal experience of people getting sick and dying, but they've been told that they can't talk about it. So it feels like, parallels. I feel a lot of your fundamental ideas that we're seeing it get played out right now so well, and people don't feel they have so much agency in every situation as well.
Thank you for that. Do either of you have any questions?
I'm okay. I have another meeting at 1:30, so I think I might have to leave just because I have to eat something before the next go. But I'm good. I'm enjoying this. I appreciate it.
I'm also good, Tapo. It's really beautiful thing to walk through the book again, and every time I do, it deepens my understanding, and I just feel like the aspects of it that are so closely related to intersectionality are really compelling. I just think the angle from which you're looking at things is really important and inclusive. So I think it's really good work. So thank you. And I too have another of these. So
All right.
but thank you, and I look forward to it's next week, right?